Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Let's Make a Better World. I'm your host, David Tear, and you can probably tell the background's different than usual. I'm on vacation in Copenhagen. I've been here for the last 4 days. I'm going to be here another 4 days. But anyway, enough of that. Let's get back to the subject at hand. I decided to make another video on space travel. I'm going to make a whole series of videos on space travel since it seems to be a very popular subject on this channel. It's one I'm really interested in too. So I figured a good place to start is the history of space travel. I actually remember most of the history of the space race. I was born in 1962, and most people seem to think the space race began in 1957, October 4th, 1957, with Sputnik, the first Russian artificial satellite, which is I got a picture of it on this slide. But anyway, let's begin. I'll get to that. So when can we really start say that the space race began? I think the beginning of the space race was the invention of the first liquid fuel rocket by Goddard in 1926. Because we need rockets to launch anything into space, and there were even some serious physicists in 1926 that thought this was going to be impossible. I don't know why. They didn't believe in rocketry was real science, but Goddard proved them wrong. He launched the world's first liquid fuel rocket, and it worked. And rockets gradually got more and more powerful and could go higher and higher. Got to the point where they could almost go into space by the 1950s, and eventually they did. And an interesting thing about all this is that the Americans were actually trying to go into space before Sputnik. There was this thing called the X-15 rocket plane that I believe was first designed in 1954, and I think the first prototype was built in 1955. And eventually, this became the fastest aircraft in the world. It wasn't a rocket. It was a rocket plane. I guess it had its own rocket engine in it, but it was able to go about 4,000 miles an hour, which is like Mach 6.7, and it was able to go at an altitude of about 20 miles. I don't think most people consider this space. It's kind of arbitrary what you consider the boundary of outer space. There's no real boundary, but I think nowadays people say it's either what is it, 100 kilometers or 62 miles. So this thing didn't quite get up into space, but it got very, very high, and that's how we were trying to get into space with basically, very, very fast airplanes with rocket engines. But that's not how it was actually done. The first Here's another picture of Sputnik 1. This was the first artificial satellite launched October 4th, 1957, by the Soviet Union. The whole world could see this thing. It could hear its beeps. And it really caused kind of stir in the United States. I mean, we knew right away it had been launched by the Soviet Union, and there was already a lot of paranoid about the Cold War and the Soviets, and a lot of people in the government, a lot of people in the free world were very scared once Russians put up Sputnik. They were afraid we were gonna launch a space platform, maybe have a something in space set up to shoot down Americans or shoot down people in the third world. We didn't know what they were gonna do, so it kind of set off an alarm, and it basically set our whole space mission into full orbit. Pardon the pun, but I believe NASA, National um, Administration of Aerospace Association. I forget what's an acronym for, but they were formed, I think, because of this. And and it wasn't just the first Sputnik. They actually launched two, and the second one just a month later they actually launched the first animal into space as well. This was the dog Laika. This was launched on Sputnik 2, I believe, November 3rd, 1957. And it took America a while to catch up. I mean, finally in 1958 we launched our first artificial satellite. January, I think it was January 28th. This was Explorer 1. So it was about almost 4 months after Sputnik, but we did finally get an artificial satellite up there. And the next thing we did, we weren't going to stop with just satellites. We wanted to get people up there too. So we started the Mercury mission. This was the first manned mission into space. These were the first U.S. astronauts, the 7 Mercury astronauts. Can't remember all their names offhand, but I think only 6 of them actually went into space. One of them got a cold and he wasn't able to go. Um, but anyway, and these were the rockets that got him up into space. I think they were all Redstone rockets, or at least the two on the left. Um, none of these were reusable, unlike the space shuttle. I mean, I guess the early space missions were very expensive in terms of resources. We had to launch a new rocket for each one. A lot of fuel as well. And then we got beat again. Unfortunately, the Russians sent the first man into space. This was April 12th, 1961. They sent Yuri Gagarin aboard. I forget what the name of the capsule was, but Soyuz. I think it was a Soyuz capsule, and he was the first man into space, and we could have beat him, I think, by a few weeks, but I don't know exactly what was going on. There were some problems in NASA. I guess there were some personnel problems. They decided to send a monkey into space before a human, maybe because the astronauts didn't want to cooperate or weren't cooperating as well as the engineers had wanted them to. And by the way, Werner von Braun, he was the chief engineer of the space program for the Americans. He was a very notorious man. I mean, I have kind of mixed feelings about him being in charge of the NASA, because he killed thousands of allies during World War II. He was responsible for the V2 rocket, which was launched against London and killed thousands of civilians during World War II. But since he was such a rocketry expert, the United States government decided to use him for NASA to try to help us get to the moon. He actually did help us get to the moon. So I don't know whether his overall karma was good or bad because of what he did. But anyway, enough of that. So yeah, then we got our own guy up there a few weeks later. That was the first American astronaut in the space was Alan Shepard. He was on the first Mercury capsule. This was a suborbital flight, and I believe this picture is not of him. This is of the Friendship 7. This is the first one that orbited the Earth. This was the third Mercury mission. That was John Glenn, who was the first American to orbit the Earth. I believe that Goddard had orbited the Earth, and there were a couple Soviet astronauts cosmonauts they called them, that orbited the Earth before we even got anybody up there. But the first two Mercury missions were not orbital flight; they were suborbital, and they were only like 15 minutes. I think it was Alan Shepard who did the first one, and then Gordo Cooper did the second one, and then finally we got John Glenn to orbit the Earth, and that was a huge accomplishment. I believe that was the biggest parade in history at the time when he returned. He almost died on the way home because his heat shield was failing, but they managed to keep it on, and he was very lucky that he survived this flight. But anyway, and then this is something that I think few people know about. After Mercury, between Mercury and Apollo, there was another manned mission in the mid 60s. It was called Project Gemini. And I think I even remember some of this. This was 1965 and 1966. This is very early still in the space program. But I mean, we were already trying to plan how we were going to get someone to the moon. But before we could do that, we had to do a bunch of other stuff first. So there were a couple of things we had to do. We had to learn how to rendezvous. So that was something new with Project Gemini. There were actually two portions of the Gemini capsule, and one portion of it had to I guess be detached from the other portion and then dock it. And that was in order to practice docking the lunar module, which we had to do on the Apollo mission. The other thing we had to practice was spacewalks. So anyway, and then we had a lot more rockets. I think we had 12 rockets. There were 12 Gemini missions. These were all the rockets that took us up on the Gemini missions. And here's a picture of the full capsule that went into space. I believe the big thing on the left, that was the whole stage 3 of the rocket that launched us up there. And then there was another portion on the right that detached and reattached. And Pretty impressive mission. Another thing we did, like I mentioned, spacewalking, and they needed a tether. This time, the only way they could walk out, be exposed to outer space was if they had a long tether with oxygen being pumped into it from the capsule. And I think by the time we had the space shuttle in the 80s, they were able to make self-contained um, yeah, oxygen modules so that the astronauts could do spacewalks without being tethered. Um, and then after Gemini, we had Apollo, and Apollo was the mission that took us to the moon. And I believe there were 11 well, there were like 12 attempts at Apollo missions, and one of them. I'll talk about the first one first. So Apollo 1, this was actually the first space disaster. These guys, these three astronauts, who are they? Gus Grissom, who was also on the Mercury mission, and Edward White, I think, and Chaffee. I don't remember their first names, but these were the three astronauts who were scheduled to go up on Apollo 1. And they all died, unfortunately. There was a terrible fire. They didn't even get into space. They were doing a practice run on Earth, on the ground, and they had an oxygen, 100% oxygen simulated atmosphere inside the capsule. I don't know why they were doing this, but I guess a spark from inside ignited, and they couldn't open the door in time, and they all burned to death. Very, very tragic. And there's the burnt remains of the inside of the capsule. So that was our first space disaster. But a couple of years later, we finally got up there. This was Apollo 7. I believe this was like maybe October 68, almost 2 years after the Apollo 1 fire. And by the way, President John F. Kennedy in 1961, shortly after he became president, he announced to the world that America had made it a mission to land the first astronaut on the moon and return him safely to Earth by the end of the 1960s. And we just barely made that deadline with Apollo 11. Pretty impressive that we did. But we were already going up. But we were already doing our first Apollo missions in 1968. Apollo 7 didn't go to the moon. But Apollo 8, that was the first one that went to the moon, didn't land on the moon. Here's a picture of it. I think it got something like 60 miles from the surface of the moon. You could see the Earth rising above the moon. Pretty spectacular photo. And Apollo 9, that one didn't go to the moon either, but that was the first one where we practiced using the lunar module. We practiced docking with the lunar module, but we did it in Earth orbit. And then Apollo 10 was another mission to the moon that didn't land on the moon. I think this one got within 10 miles of the moon's surface, and that's a pretty spectacular picture of the moon's surface with the Apollo capsule above it. And then finally, as I think you guys all know, Apollo 11 was the first manned mission to land on the moon, and I believe that's Neil Armstrong with a flag, and the other astronaut who landed on the moon, Buzz Aldrin, probably was the one who took his picture. And there's the lunar module in the background. And actually, this isn't Apollo 11 because someone has the lunar rover. But anyway, there is a famous picture of Neil Armstrong with a flag. Um, and then I'll just go through the other Apollo missions. I think this is Apollo 13. I'm not sure. These were the three astronauts, and they made it into a movie. I'm sure you guys probably all saw the movie Apollo 13. So Apollo 12 was Apollo 11 and Apollo 12 were the first two successful lunar landings. There were a total of 6 successful lunar landing missions, but Apollo 13 was what they called a successful failure. It was a failure because we weren't able to get to the moon. And I think it was really a triumph in a lot of ways. I mean, even though we didn't land on the moon, we got these guys safely back to Earth. And the command module was just like toast. I mean, we were really lucky we made it back. So many things could have gone wrong on these missions, but we managed. We ended up using the lunar. They ended up losing the lunar module as a lifeboat, and they used like just about every drop of power the thing had just to get back home safely. Pretty remarkable they were able to do that. I highly recommend watching the movie if you haven't already seen it. And then, yeah, this was the Apollo 15 was the first one where we had the lunar rover. So we actually had built a car that we drove on the moon. We didn't just land on the moon, but we drove a car, which I think is pretty amazing. And we did it 3 times. I think Apollo 15, 16, and 17. 17 was the last lunar mission, the last manned lunar mission, November 1972, over 50 years ago. I mean, I'm appalled that no human has been back to the moon in over 50 years. I mean, who would have thought? I mean, I don't think anybody at this time would have believed that would be the case. I mean, people thought we were going to have permanent settlements on the moon by now. You know, and even maybe space colonies, that were built from lunar materials. I mean, all this is kind of predicted in the movie 2001: A Space Odyssey. People thought that was going to come true, but it didn't. But anyway, just thought I'd mention that. And this was a night launch. I think this was the only night launch of the Apollo missions. For some reason, I don't know why, people were losing interest in going into space in the early 70s. I could never figure it out. I mean, I guess the 70s was just kind of a bad time. People were getting very disillusioned. We had a lot of crises in the 70s. We had the oil embargo, we had terrible inflation and unemployment, we had Watergate. People were getting very critical, and they weren't so optimistic about going into space anymore. And I think it was even more than that. I think people in general lost a lot of trust and interest in modern science, which I always thought was very unfortunate. But I remember that too. What's this picture? I guess it's Apollo 17. Oh yeah, and then after the Apollo mission, our next manned mission was called Skylab. This was, I think, Skylab 1. And we actually had 3 Skylab satellites sent up. And this is like a space laboratory. I mean, this is pretty remarkable. And these guys were on these things for a really, really long time. I think Skylab 3. So this was 1973 and 1974. I believe Skylab 3 was up for 84 days, almost 3 months. And these poor astronauts inside, they were living in zero gravity for almost 3 months. And when they got back to the Earth, they were just overwhelmed by gravity. I think one of the astronauts said he felt like he weighed 1,000 tons when he got back to Earth. But these guys did a lot of exercising and they kept in shape. And even though they were, living on zero gravity, they came back healthier than they were when they left. So they did pretty good up there. And then 1975, we had the first joint mission between the United States and the Soviet Union. This was the Apollo-Soyuz link up. I didn't watch this. I missed this. I was at summer camp at the time, experiencing the usual disasters up there. For me, I don't want to get into that, but I wish I'd seen this because this was our last manned space mission for 6 years, I believe, and it was a joint mission between the United States and the Soviet Union. So I'd say this was a pretty big triumph, and that was 1975. And then the next thing we did in space was a space shuttle. And before we actually launched the space shuttle, we had to piggyback it aboard a 747, I guess, to test its aerodynamics, make sure that it was aerodynamically sound. I think that's what that was all about. I remember this got publicized quite a bit. I didn't see what the big deal was. A space shuttle riding on the back of a 747, big deal. But anyway, finally, 1981, April 12th, 1981, we launched the first space shuttle. And interesting, this was the 20th anniversary of the first manned space mission by Yuri Gagarin, April 12th, 1961. So, and I watched this. I was at the University of Michigan at the time. I was a freshman there, and I was very excited to see this thing go up. I really was. And yeah, then unfortunately, a few years later, 1986, yeah, April 28th, 1986, we had our second major space disaster. These 7 astronauts, can't remember their names, but it included a female school teacher, the one on the, I guess, the right rear, and also African American, and it was a very, very unfortunate because she was like an elementary school teacher. All her students knew her. They were all really excited that she was going to space, but she didn't make it. None of them did. The thing blew up about 10 miles up in the atmosphere. Very, very, very tragic. And I watched replays of this thing several times, kind of like 9/11, kind of etched in my mind in a lot of the same ways. So terrible tragedy. But we did continue the space shuttle mission. I think the next one that we launched successfully was in 1988, and we kept doing it. We actually had 135 space shuttle missions. I'll get into this later, but maybe I'll just switch to the last one. So yeah, this was the last space shuttle mission. This was 2011. So this was 135th space shuttle mission. Yeah, right before President Obama canceled the space shuttle program. I was really upset about this, by the way. I mean, now our government, this is since 2011, so for the last 13 years, NASA has not been sending any American astronauts into space. If Americans want to get into space, they either have to get a ride from another country. I think Europe is launching, I think France is launching people into space, or they have to get a ride from a billionaire. It's the only way Americans can get into space now, which I think is very, very sad. Our government doesn't seem to think it's a priority to send Americans into space anymore, which I just think is very unfortunate. But what else have we done in space? 1980, 86, this was Russia again, Soviet Union still at the time. In 1986, they built this big, huge space platform called Mir. I think it's still the biggest thing ever built in space. It was a huge, huge thing. I don't know how many astronauts this thing held. I think hundreds of them. And many, many went from very long periods of time. I think the longest period of time anybody spent in space was aboard this thing. I'm pretty sure something like 3 years. I don't even know who that was. But, I think a lot of Americans went on this thing too. I think it's pretty ugly. But then there was another thing, which I think is a lot prettier, called the International Space Station. This was built in 1998 and it's still operating. Yeah, the Mir stopped operating in 2001, and then I think it just, I don't know what happened to it. I think it just fell apart and probably fell to the earth somewhere. I hope they were protected. But yeah, but the International Space Station, or the ISS, is still up there and it's still operating, and people are still going to it and doing a bunch of important experiments and tests up there. So I'm glad that that's there. But I really would have liked to have seen much, much more done in space. And I guess I just have one more thing to say. So yeah, what else? I mean, what else are we doing in space? Well, SpaceX. There's a privately owned company called SpaceX. I believe its CEO is was it Jeff Bezos, I think. Yeah, so it's funded by a billionaire, basically. And now this is the only way Americans can get into space, basically. I mean, we have to hitch a ride from a billionaire to go into space, which I think is pretty sad. I mean, we're at the mercy of billionaires getting into the new frontier. I don't know what that says about our society, but But that's the way it is, like Walter Cronkite used to say. You know, I think it's unfortunate, but at least people are still going up into space, and I'd like to someday. I don't know if I ever will. I'm hoping to. You know, maybe if I can ever afford a ticket aboard SpaceX or Virgin Galactic, I'll do it. I want to orbit the Earth at least once. I don't think it'll count unless I orbit the Earth at least once. But anyway, so that concludes my video on. Yeah, I guess this is another SpaceX launch. That concludes my video on the history of space travel, manned space travel. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.